Marcus Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, surveying the empire he'd built from nothing. At 38, he commanded a tech conglomerate worth $47 billion, his name synonymous with innovation and ruthless business acumen. The Manhattan skyline stretched before him like conquered territory, each building a testament to the power money could buy. Yet as Sunday morning light filtered through the glass, casting long shadows across his empty office, Marcus felt more alone than he had as a homeless teenager sleeping in subway stations. The mahogany desk behind him held the evidence of his success. Signed contracts worth hundreds of millions, invitations to exclusive galas, magazine covers featuring his latest acquisitions. But it also held something else. Divorce papers from his third marriage, custody documents limiting his access to his own children, and medical reports confirming what he'd suspected for months. The stress of constant acquisition had ravaged his body, leaving him with chronic insomnia, panic attacks, and a heart condition that no amount of money could fully heal. His phone buzzed incessantly with congratulations from business associates celebrating his latest hostile takeover of a struggling renewable energy company. The media called it another masterstroke of corporate strategy. But Marcus knew the truth. He'd destroyed 300 jobs and crushed a family business simply because he could. The victory felt hollow, meaningless, like everything else in his carefully constructed world. Outside, church bells echoed across the city, their ancient sound cutting through the modern cacophony of traffic and construction. Marcus hadn't been inside a church since his grandmother's funeral 20 years ago, but something about those bells stirred a memory of peace he'd forgotten existed. His reflection in the window showed a man who had everything and somehow lost himself entirely. The penthouse apartment Marcus called home sprawled across 3 floors of Manhattan's most exclusive building, filled with priceless art and furniture that designers had assured him projected success and sophistication. But as he wandered through rooms that echoed with emptiness, each perfectly curated space felt like a museum exhibit rather than a home. The Monet hanging in his living room cost more than most people's houses, yet it brought him no joy. The Italian marble floors clicked hollowly under his footsteps as he moved through spaces designed for entertaining hundreds, but occupied only by him. In the master bedroom, family photos sat on the nightstand like accusations. His daughter Emma, now 16, smiled from her graduation photo, an event he'd missed for a board meeting in Tokyo. His son Jacob, 13, looked uncomfortable in their last Christmas picture together, already learning to expect disappointment from his father. His ex-wife Sarah gazed back at him from their wedding photo, her eyes full of hope that he'd systematically destroyed with 18-hour workdays and month-long business trips. The medication bottles on his bathroom counter told another story. Antidepressants that barely touched his emotional numbness, sleeping pills that provided only chemical unconsciousness, blood pressure medication for a heart that raced with anxiety despite his outward calm. He'd consulted the best doctors money could buy, but they all said the same thing. His body was breaking down from stress and isolation. Marcus picked up his phone to call Emma, desperate for connection, but realized he didn't know what to say. When had he last had a real conversation with his children that wasn't about their school performance or his business schedule? When had he last laughed, really laughed, at something that wasn't a competitor's misfortune? The silence of his apartment pressed down on him like a weight, suffocating and inescapable. Something pulled Marcus from his apartment that Sunday morning, a restlessness that expensive whiskey and premium cigars couldn't numb. He found himself walking through neighborhoods he'd never explored despite living in Manhattan for 15 years. His usual armor of tailored suits had been replaced by simple jeans and a sweater, making him feel strangely vulnerable as he moved through the city without the buffer of chauffeurs and security details. The streets were quieter than usual, filled with families heading to various Sunday services. Marcus watched them with fascination. Children skipping beside parents who seemed genuinely happy. Elderly couples walking hand in hand after decades together. Teenagers chatting excitedly about their plans for the day. When had he last felt that kind of simple contentment? When had anticipation meant something other than another deal to close or competitor to crush? His feet carried him away from the gleaming towers of Midtown toward a neighborhood that reminded him of his childhood. Tree-lined streets with older buildings, small businesses that had survived gentrification, the sound of genuine laughter spilling from windows. He passed a small park where families picnicked and children played, their joy so authentic it made his chest ache with longing. The church bells he'd heard from his office grew louder as he walked, their bronze voices seeming to call to something deep inside him that he'd buried under years of calculated ambition. He found himself following the sound without conscious decision, his expensive shoes carrying him toward a destination he couldn't name but somehow needed to reach. For the first time in decades, Marcus Sterling wasn't planning his next move, wasn't calculating advantage or profit margin. He was simply walking, drawn by something larger than strategy or success, toward an encounter that would change everything. Grace Community Church sat modestly between a laundromat and a small grocery store, its weathered brick facade and simple wooden cross speaking of decades of faithful service to the neighborhood. Unlike the grand cathedrals Marcus occasionally attended for business networking, this building projected warmth rather than intimidation. Window boxes filled with late-blooming flowers softened the urban landscape, and a hand-painted sign announced "All are welcome" in multiple languages. Through the open doors, Marcus could hear singing, not the formal hymns of his childhood memories, but something joyful and alive that seemed to pulse with genuine emotion. People of all ages and backgrounds streamed into the building, greeting each other with embraces that spoke of real community rather than social obligation. He watched from across the street, feeling like an outsider observing a world he'd never learned to inhabit. An elderly man in a wheelchair was being helped up the accessibility ramp by a teenager with purple hair and multiple piercings, an unlikely pair whose easy conversations suggested deep friendship. A young mother struggled with a stroller while juggling a diaper bag and coffee cup, only to have 3 different people rush to assist her without being asked. These weren't the calculated social interactions of Marcus's world, where every gesture served some ulterior purpose. The pastor stood at the entrance, shaking hands and embracing congregants with the kind of authentic warmth Marcus hadn't experienced in years. Pastor David Rodriguez was perhaps 50, with graying temples and laugh lines that spoke of a life filled with both sorrow and joy. His simple black suit was well worn, but clean, and his eyes held a peace that Marcus envied with startling intensity. Marcus found himself frozen on the sidewalk, simultaneously drawn to and terrified of the community inside that building. Part of him wanted to flee back to his familiar isolation, but something deeper held him in place, watching this demonstration of human connection that his wealth had never been able to purchase. The service ended, and congregants began filing out of Grace Community Church, their faces bright with the kind of satisfaction Marcus had never found in his boardroom victories. He remained across the street, paralyzed between longing and fear, watching as Pastor Rodriguez lingered to speak with each person individually. The pastor's attention seemed completely focused on whoever stood before him, a gift Marcus had never learned to give. As the crowd thinned, Pastor Rodriguez began collecting abandoned bulletins and straightening chairs, his movements economical but unhurried. He paused occasionally to pray quietly over empty pews, his lips moving in silent conversations Marcus couldn't fathom. There was something profoundly peaceful about the man's presence, a centeredness that made Marcus acutely aware of his own internal chaos. Without conscious decision, Marcus found himself crossing the street and climbing the worn stone steps to the church entrance. His heart hammered against his ribs with an intensity that reminded him of his first major business presentation, but this felt infinitely more significant. He was about to step into territory where his usual tools, money, influence, intimidation, held no power. Pastor Rodriguez looked up from his cleaning as Marcus appeared in the doorway, and something in the older man's eyes shifted from polite curiosity to deep concern. Perhaps it was the way Marcus stood, shoulders rigid with suppressed emotion, hands clenched at his sides, face carefully composed despite the storm raging inside. Or perhaps Pastor Rodriguez had simply learned to recognize souls in crisis. "Can I help you, son?" the pastor asked gently, setting aside his cleaning supplies and giving Marcus his full attention. The simple question, spoken with such genuine care by a complete stranger, shattered something inside Marcus that had been holding back a flood of pain and confusion and desperate need for something he couldn't name. Marcus Sterling, who had stared down corporate titans and testified before Congress without showing emotion, found himself overwhelmed by the pastor's simple kindness. 25 years of suppressed grief and loneliness crashed over him like a tsunami, and the tears he'd been holding back since his grandmother's funeral finally broke free. His carefully constructed facade crumbled as he stood in the doorway of that small church, sobbing with the raw intensity of a man who had forgotten how to feel. Pastor Rodriguez moved forward without hesitation, placing a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder and guiding him to a front pew. He said nothing, understanding instinctively that words would be inadequate for whatever pain was pouring out of this well-dressed stranger. Instead, he simply sat beside Marcus and waited, his presence steady and non-judgmental. "I don't know why I'm here," Marcus managed between sobs, his voice cracking like an adolescent's. "I don't even believe in... I haven't been to church in 20 years. I heard the bells and I can't." The pastor handed him tissues from a small box kept in each pew, a detail that spoke of experience with human crisis. "You don't need to explain anything," Pastor Rodriguez said quietly. "Sometimes we find ourselves where we need to be without understanding why." Marcus looked around the simple sanctuary through tear-blurred eyes. The stained glass windows weren't elaborate masterpieces, but simple panels depicting scenes of healing and compassion. The wooden cross at the front was plain, unpretentious, speaking of sacrifice rather than triumph. Everything about this space whispered of refuge, of unconditional acceptance, concepts that had become foreign to Marcus's world of conditional relationships and transactional interactions. "I have everything," Marcus whispered, the words tumbling out unbidden. "Everything anyone could want. And I'm dying inside. I'm completely alone, and I don't know how to fix it." In that quiet sanctuary, surrounded by the lingering echoes of morning worship, Marcus found himself telling a complete stranger truths he'd never admitted to therapists who charged $500 an hour. The words poured out of him like water through a broken dam. Years of isolation, failed relationships, children who barely knew him, sleepless nights spent staring at ceilings in empty apartments across 3 different cities. "I started with nothing," Marcus said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "Foster homes, group homes, aging out of the system at 18 with $47 and nowhere to go. I swore I'd never be powerless again, never be poor again, never let anyone have the ability to throw me away like garbage." Pastor Rodriguez listened without interruption, his presence steady and accepting. He'd heard countless confessions over 2 decades of ministry, but something about Marcus's raw honesty moved him deeply. This wasn't the polished testimony of someone seeking absolution. This was the desperate cry of a soul lost in its own success. "So I built walls," Marcus continued. "I made myself indispensable, irreplaceable, untouchable. I accumulated money and power like armor, thinking if I had enough of both, no one could ever hurt me again. But somewhere along the way, I locked myself inside those walls. I pushed away everyone who tried to get close, destroyed every relationship that required vulnerability." He described his marriages, 3 women who'd initially been drawn to his drive and success, then gradually suffocated by his inability to prioritize anything above business. He talked about watching his children grow up through birthday cards and Christmas gifts, maintaining relationships through financial transactions because emotional connections felt too dangerous. "Last week I fired a man who'd worked for me for 12 years, Marcus whispered. He had 4 kids and a mortgage, but his department's numbers were down 3%. 3%. I destroyed his life over a quarterly report, and all I felt was relief that my stock price would stabilize." Pastor Rodriguez had ministered to drug addicts and murderers, to abuse victims and corporate criminals, but Marcus's story affected him in a unique way. Here was a man who had achieved everything society promised would bring happiness, only to discover that success without soul was merely sophisticated suffering. The pastor recognized the particular agony of someone who had climbed the mountain only to find emptiness at the summit. "Marcus," the pastor said gently, speaking his name for the first time, "what you're describing isn't unusual. I see it more often than you might think. People who've won the game but lost themselves in the process. The question isn't how you got here. The question is where you go from here." Marcus looked up with red-rimmed eyes, desperate for some formula, some strategy that would fix the mess he'd made of his life. "I don't know how to be different. This is who I am, who I've always been since I was 18 and terrified. I don't know how to trust people, how to be vulnerable, how to love without calculating the cost." "Those aren't permanent character flaws," Pastor Rodriguez replied. "They're learned survival mechanisms that serve their purpose but now imprison you. The beautiful thing about human beings is our capacity for change, for growth, for redemption, no matter how lost we become. The pastor stood and walked to a small table beside the altar, returning with a worn leather Bible. "I'd like to read you something if you don't mind. It's about a man who thought he had to earn love, had to prove his worth through achievement and perfection. But he discovered something that changed everything." Marcus nodded, too emotionally drained to resist. He'd dismissed religion as weakness for most of his adult life, but sitting in that peaceful sanctuary, he found himself hungry for any wisdom that might ease his suffering. Pastor Rodriguez opened the Bible to a passage he knew by heart but read aloud anyway, his voice gentle but firm. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest," Pastor Rodriguez read, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience alongside ancient wisdom. "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Marcus sat in silence, the words settling into spaces in his heart he'd forgotten existed. Rest. When had he last truly rested? Not the chemical unconsciousness of prescription sleep aids, but genuine peace of mind and spirit. The concept seemed as foreign as speaking Mandarin, yet something deep inside him responded with desperate longing. "I don't understand what that means," Marcus admitted. "I've been carrying burdens so long, I don't know who I am without them. My whole identity is built on struggle, on proving I'm worthy of existing. How do you just let go of that?" Pastor Rodriguez closed the Bible and leaned forward, his eyes kind but direct. "You don't do it alone, and you don't do it overnight. It's a process of learning to trust, first God, then yourself, then others. It's about discovering that your worth isn't based on what you do, but on who you are. And who you are is a child of God, beloved and valuable regardless of your achievements or failures." The words sounded impossible, too good to be true. Marcus had spent 40 years believing that love was conditional, that acceptance had to be earned through performance. The idea that he could be valued simply for existing challenged everything he'd built his life upon. "What would that even look like?" Marcus asked. "If I believed that, really believed it, what would change? How would I live differently?" Pastor Rodriguez smiled, recognizing the first stirrings of hope in Marcus's questions. "That's between you and God to discover. But I can tell you this. It starts with forgiveness. Forgiving others who hurt you, yes, but more importantly, forgiving yourself for the hurt you've caused and the love you've rejected." In the hours that followed, Pastor Rodriguez shared stories from his own journey. His struggles with pride during seminary, his first marriage that ended in bitter divorce, the period of depression when he'd questioned everything he believed. Marcus listened with growing amazement as this man of faith revealed his own humanity, his own failures, and moments of doubt. "I used to think spiritual maturity meant having all the answers," Pastor Rodriguez admitted. "I preached with absolute certainty about God's will and purpose, until life humbled me enough to realize that faith isn't about knowing everything. It's about trusting in the midst of not knowing." The pastor described his journey back to authentic faith after his divorce. The slow process of rebuilding relationships with his children, the daily choice to serve others despite his own brokenness. His words painted a picture of redemption that wasn't dramatic or instantaneous, but gradual and sustained by community and grace. "The people in this congregation," Pastor Rodriguez continued, gesturing toward the empty pews, "they're not here because they have their lives figured out. They're here because they know they need help, need community, need something larger than themselves to make sense of existence. That's not weakness, Marcus. That's wisdom." Marcus found himself nodding, understanding beginning to dawn like sunrise after the longest night. "So what do I do? How do I start? I've burned so many bridges, hurt so many people. My own children barely speak to me. How do you come back from that?" "One relationship at a time," Pastor Rodriguez replied. "One honest conversation, one genuine apology, one act of selfless love. You can't undo the past, but you can choose to write a different future. And you don't have to do it alone." The pastor pulled out his phone and showed Marcus photos from the church's community garden, their food bank, their mentorship program for aging out foster kids, programs that serve the neighborhood without fanfare or recognition. This is what purpose looks like when it's not about building your own kingdom. Block 11, the first steps. As afternoon sunlight slanted through the simple stained glass windows, Marcus made a decision that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He asked Pastor Rodriguez if he could attend the next Sunday's service, not as a networking opportunity or social obligation, but as someone genuinely seeking community and meaning. "Of course," Pastor Rodriguez replied warmly, "but I should warn you, we're not a polished operation. Our building is old, our programs are underfunded, and our congregation includes some pretty rough characters alongside the saints." Marcus almost laughed at the irony. "Pastor, I've spent 20 years in boardrooms with people who'd sell their mothers for a quarterly profit boost. I think I can handle a few rough characters who are actually trying to be better people." They spent the next hour discussing practical steps Marcus could take to begin healing the relationships he'd damaged. The pastor emphasized that grand gestures and expensive gifts weren't the answer. His children and ex-wives needed consistency, presence, and genuine change more than they needed his money. "Start small," Pastor Rodriguez advised. "Call Emma and Jacob just to ask about their day, with no agenda other than listening. Show up to their events without checking your phone. Learn their friends' names, their favorite foods, their dreams for the future. Be present in the mundane moments. That's where real relationship happens." Marcus pulled out his phone to make notes, then stopped himself. This wasn't another business strategy to optimize. This was about learning to be human again. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and simply listened, allowing the pastor's wisdom to settle into his heart without immediately trying to systematize or execute it. "What about my business?" Marcus asked. "I can't just walk away from $47 billion in responsibilities. Shareholders, employees, contracts." "No one's asking you to become a pauper," Pastor Rodriguez replied. "But maybe you could start asking different questions. Instead of, 'How can I maximize profit?' try asking, 'How can I maximize good?' Your resources could transform lives if guided by different values." Block 12. Transformation begins. The following weeks brought changes that Marcus's business associates found baffling and his family found cautiously hopeful. He began attending Grace Community Church regularly, sitting in the back at first, but gradually moving forward as he found comfort in the genuine community Pastor Rodriguez had described. The congregation's diverse mix of professionals and laborers, elderly saints and recovering addicts, created an environment where his wealth mattered less than his willingness to serve. Marcus started volunteering at the church's food bank, his expensive suits replaced by jeans and work shirts, as he loaded boxes and served meals to families facing the kind of poverty he remembered from his youth. The work was humbling in the best possible way, stripping away the artificial barriers he'd built between himself and authentic human connection. His relationship with his children began to shift as he learned to listen without trying to fix or advise. Emma, initially skeptical of his sudden interest in her life, gradually began sharing her college anxieties and relationship concerns when she realized her father was actually present during their conversations. Jacob, still guarded, nonetheless seemed surprised when Marcus attended his school's science fair without taking a single business call. At Sterling Enterprises, Marcus implemented changes that sent shockwaves through the corporate world. He established a foundation focused on education and poverty relief, funded by a percentage of company profits that would have previously gone to executive bonuses. He restructured layoff policies to include job retraining and placement assistance, turning what had been cold terminations into opportunities for displaced workers. His competitors called him soft. His board members questioned his sanity. But Marcus found himself sleeping through the night for the first time in years. The chronic anxiety that had plagued him for decades began to ease as he discovered the peace that comes from alignment between values and actions. "You seem different," Sarah, his second ex-wife, observed during a rare civil conversation about their son's upcoming birthday. "Calmer. More present." Marcus smiled, recognizing the truth in her words. "I'm learning to be a human being instead of a human doing." Block 13. The new Marcus. 1 year after that tearful Sunday morning at Grace Community Church, Marcus Sterling stood once again at his office window. But the view had changed completely. The city below remained the same concrete and steel landscape, but he saw it now through eyes transformed by grace and community. Where once he'd seen territory to conquer, he now saw neighborhoods to serve. Where once he'd seen competitors to crush, he now saw potential partners in making the world better. His desk still held contracts and financial reports, but they were now interspersed with photos from the church food bank, letters from scholarship recipients, and handmade cards from children whose families had been helped by Sterling Enterprises' new community initiatives. His business remained profitable, more so than before, but profit was no longer his primary measure of success. Emma called him daily now, their conversations ranging from serious discussions about her master's degree to silly arguments about which superhero movie was best. Jacob had started bringing friends over to Marcus's apartment, the once sterile space now filled with the chaos and laughter of teenage boys who saw him as a person rather than an ATM. Even his relationship with his ex-wives had evolved from bitter acrimony to respectful co-parenting. Pastor Rodriguez had become not just his spiritual mentor, but one of his closest friends, their weekly coffee meetings an anchor point in Marcus's continuing journey of growth. The pastor's wisdom continued to challenge and comfort him as he navigated the delicate balance between worldly success and spiritual health. The changes hadn't been without cost. Some business relationships had ended when Marcus refused to participate in ethically questionable deals. His net worth had decreased as he redirected resources toward philanthropy. But for the first time in his adult life, Marcus felt genuinely wealthy, rich in relationships, purpose, and peace. As he prepared to leave the office for Jacob's baseball game, Marcus paused to look at a framed verse Pastor Rodriguez had given him. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Below it, in his own handwriting, was his answer. No good at all. But losing the world to find your soul, priceless. Thank you for joining us on Marcus Sterling's incredible journey from isolation to community, from success to significance. His story reminds us that it's never too late to change direction, to choose relationships over achievements, to discover that true wealth can't be measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the love we share. We hope Marcus's transformation inspires you to examine what truly matters in your own life. Please let us know in the comments where you're listening from around the world. We love hearing from our global community and learning how these stories resonate across different cultures and experiences. Remember, no matter how lost you may feel, there's always a door marked grace waiting for you to knock. Until next time, keep seeking the connections that make life truly rich.